I've been working in biological art for the last probably 15 or 17 years. I've been working specifically with DNA. And with DNA, I think of it as both a medium and a thematic in the work. So for instance, I'm using DNA to both make pictures of things and to perform, and also as a very subject matter in which I'm describing things.
So now I've turned on the power, I've inserted all the lanes of DNA, I've turned on the power, and now at this point the only thing that I can really do horribly wrong is jiggle this table too much. But right now the DNA is beginning to move into the gel, and you can see this blue stuff at the beginning of these, from these holes, will actually start to migrate up toward the top of the picture. The blue stuff actually isn't the DNA, it's just a dye that I've inserted with the DNA, which helps us, which makes it easier for me to squirt into those holes. It can be damning, especially when your eyesight starts to go to get it right into the hole, so that's what the blue dye is for.
For me, comes out of a practice in emerging media, which is basically taking or seizing things which are not yet communication mediums, essentially forcing them to be. So for instance, taking something like DNA, which was maybe never really intended to make pictures, and forcing it to make pictures. And by forcing it, seeing the way that it kind of almost betrays its tendencies and other meanings than we normally have foregrounded in popular culture. My background is in painting in terms of a university degree. I studied pre-med when I was an undergraduate student, but then I graduated as a painter. And I went on to do my MFA, again, mostly working with computers and electronica. It wasn't until 1996, I think, where I began working with biology again. Maybe it was 95. It was in response to a big project called the Visible Human Project. And this was a project in which a Texas death row inmate was given lethal injection and then sliced into 2,000 sections, which were digitized. He became the first virtual human created from a living human. And to me, this kind of notion of like destroying the flesh to make the digital was what got me looking into biotech and the way in which vision technologies were invading the body. And through that, it was kind of a natural segue into working with more molecular biology things. It has to do, my focus has to do with the way in which DNA is said to represent us in all different ways. It's said to represent who we are as individuals, to be able to individuate us from any other human being on Earth. It's said to be the thing which tells us the sort of story of our past and our ancestry and where we came from. And it also purports to tell the story of our future and our proclivities and our weaknesses. And this is where I intervene as an artist and essentially, I think, undermine a lot of these very very reductive ways of thinking about life.
The DNA fingerprint, this iconic image which you've seen in shows like CSI and other kind of crime show franchises, I call, or I consider to be the most authoritative image we have. It is the most authoritative image we have. It's the basis of, not only identification, like who did it, who gets to be innocent and who gets to be guilty, but it's also the basis for all these other ways of knowing the self. It's the basis for the idea of who we were, or what our genetic past is, who our ancestors were. So it looks to the past. It also looks to the future. This idea of DNA images and DNA information can be telling us deterministic things about our aptitudes and our abilities. DNA can be, in some people's minds, to still be considered sort of a destiny. So on that basis, I've considered the DNA image to be the most authoritative image we have.
It comes out of a very kind of layperson understanding, on my part, I guess, of what DNA fingerprinting originally was. You know, the idea is when you think of this, you somehow think of like a print, or like some slice of nature which is just sort of blown up large. So the DNA image, I think, to the layperson seems very natural, just in the same way that the footprint or a fingerprint might. But it's to produce a DNA image requires so much scientific construction. It involves not just extracting the DNA, but then segmenting it with various kinds of enzymes, molecular primers, or probes, and all these different ways of segmenting and making visible in gelatins. That project really has to do with, in a way, it's a way of showing, in the most direct way, the idea of the DNA image as a cultural construct. So what I do in this piece is I take DNA always from the same organism, and I process it in different ways to make different pictures. And the idea was that by making pictures, it's almost a kind of a very strong argument for the fact that difference can be constructed from really what is a kind of a mat of human sameness, and that by turning DNA into this kind of a medium for artistic whimsy, the notion is that it would also then open the doors for rethinking DNA as this kind of cultural construct of absolute truth, absolute certainty, and absolute authority.
And I thought it was interesting that about 10 years ago, a DNA analyst at the FBI in the States said, we really like this term genetic DNA fingerprinting. And we like it because, and I love this term, because it invokes in the mind of a jury that we're identifying one individual to the exclusion of all others. Now, typically I hear of artists speaking of words like invoking, and poets like to invoke with their language, but not usually legal people, and certainly not people who are responsible for educating truth, guilt versus innocence, right? The idea there, you don't usually hear terms like, we want to invoke a certain feeling in the people that are about to decide upon someone's fate. So I thought this was quite interesting that the FBI really liked this term DNA fingerprinting because it invoked a kind of belief that this technology was going to tell them once and for all who is who.
It's one package, I think. You know, I think of these projects as doing a lot of different things. They're about making pictures. They're about challenging oneself to think of all the different meanings that DNA might have, and then to be able to think about how to make that very image or how to symbolize that. It's also about, in the course of doing this, it's the idea that, I guess in my practice, it's I'm very process-oriented. And so I might begin with a kind of very rough understanding about literally like the kind of conceptually what all this means. And it's not until really working with the materials that it becomes clearer and crisper. So in these projects, there's a lot of things that are combined. There's this artistic end, there's kind of a tinker end, in some ways I'm very idealistic about the idea that I learn the things I do and I come up with the sort of theorems that I do about what DNA means in the course of working with it, in the course of like dealing with this deep material. Yes, and there's a politic to it too. I think it's a double politic. On the one hand, I think I like the idea of allowing things to be complicated and complex. And I think whenever there's a kind of a strong claim that something is as simple as, you know, we are our DNA, or DNA is your destiny, I want to do all I can to undermine that simplification. I think I enjoy the complex. And I think in the ways that DNA is being sort of foreshadowed as the ultimate surveillance tool, I also want to be able to provide the culture at large, I guess, in the most humble way possible, some of the arguments against giving DNA that total omnipotence.
So DNA is a really long string. In the human body, it's 3 billion base pairs long, 3 billion A, C, G's, and T's. What that molecular scissors does is whenever it sees the right combination of base pairs, it snips them. So it snips this DNA into smaller pieces. And there are hundreds of different versions of enzymes, and each one acts in a slightly different way. Each one has a different target sequence.
So what I do in a performance like this is I'm performing an experiment. And so when we say performance, they're both artistic performances, but they're also performances in the way that someone working in a lab would said to be performing a task. They're kind of double entendres. So what I do when I do a performance like this is I complete the DNA imaging process. So I come to the show with tubes of DNA, which I've pre-prepared by adding just the right enzymes and just the right ways of cutting them and segmenting them. And then when I come to the performance, I have those tubes and I insert them into a DNA gel. And then this DNA gel, I polarize. I put electrical probes at each end of it and allow the DNA to move through the gel. And this then becomes the sort of third layer of performance. The DNA literally performs for the audience as it moves through this gelatin to form an image. So it's kind of, again, it's threefold performance. It's me performing as an artist, it's me performing a task, as someone who knows how to do that task, and it's lastly the DNA performing as evidence. When I come to do a show, there's always, you're making the gels usually under strange conditions with your little portable tools, and sometimes you're underslept, and you're trying to do a lot of other things, and so you're always kind of making these experiments under like somewhat non-optimal conditions, and you're then trying to perform something that normally in a laboratory you can have complete focus and isolation when you're doing. It's almost an impossibility that everything will go exactly as expected. But I think with this kind of very ephemeral art practice, that's just part of the, I think it's part of the excitement, and I think it's also part of the, I guess the understanding, I guess, that we bring to it as artists, that it's not going to be the same every time. It can vary. You can get happy surprises and you can get unhappy ones.
The authority of currency. I thought about the authority of royalty. I thought about the kind of old authorities that might have run the castles out here. And I tried to make a picture of it. And you won't be able to see this, again, really start to take shape until it gets closer to the top of the gel. But I'm hoping with this picture you'll eventually see something that you'll realize is a picture of authority itself.
When I started working with DNA, it was just around the time that the Human Genome Project was being completed. And it was a time when the kind of gene fetish of the culture at large was crazy. And you had phrases like, you are your DNA, DNA is destiny. You had people saying every step you take is was predicted in your DNA. And there were these very, very strong statements. 10 years later, well, maybe 15 years later, the culture has had a little bit of a sort of swing with reason. So this kind of notion that DNA was everything. Now people are realizing the microbiome and the bacterias on our body, in our guts, they're enormous in the makeup of our character. And then furthermore, even DNA itself, it's not so much the code that's always important, but it's the way that code gets interpreted in the cell, the way it gets performed, you might say. Because in fact, within the cell, certain genes are turned on and turned off, not on the basis of just DNA codings, but also on the basis of chemicals in our body, which signal certain things to be active and certain things not to be. So in a way, everything about humans got complex again. But there was a period there, and I think it's really the period in which my work was kind of, my sort of opinions were really quite steeled, was this moment when DNA was this totalitarian force, right? And I think now I think there's kind of a pendulum swing, and we're starting to see sort of culturally the kind of complexity again of nature and biology.